The shift from crisis to confrontation did not come with speeches or ultimatums. It arrived through movement. By the third week of April, naval activity across the Western Pacific had exceeded every peacetime benchmark recorded since the Cold War. Patrol zones overlapped, transit corridors narrowed, the margin for misinterpretation vanished quietly. On April 18th, at 21:06 UTC, a U.S. Navy carrier strike group operating east of Luzon altered course without announcement. USS Ronald Reagan, accompanied by cruisers and destroyers under emissions control, entered a region Chinese planners had long defined as contested but unenforced. The maneuver was legal. The message was deliberate. Chinese response was measured. 2 hours later, PLA Navy surface combatants sortied from bases along the southern coast, moving on parallel vectors well outside engagement range. Long-range maritime patrol aircraft shadowed the American formation from altitude. Fire control radars activated briefly, then disengaged. No weapons were armed. The interaction lasted 9 hours. It ended without incident, but not without consequence. For the first time in months, both sides acknowledged that deterrence patrols had become contact patrols. The following day, April 19th, Chinese forces announced a large-scale naval readiness exercise in the Taiwan Strait. The declaration came after units were already underway. Missile boats dispersed from hardened shelters, amphibious transports repositioned within port approaches, fighter aircraft increased sortie rates from coastal airfields. Taiwan elevated its alert level within minutes. Reserve notifications were issued quietly. Civil aviation routes were adjusted. At 14:32 local time, a U.S. reconnaissance aircraft operating in international airspace south of Okinawa was intercepted by 2 Chinese fighters. The intercept was aggressive but controlled. Visual identification passes were conducted at unsafe distances. 1 Chinese aircraft crossed the American plane's nose by less than 50 meters. Cockpit footage later reviewed by analysts showed no deviation in control surfaces. The pilots on both sides maintained discipline. The encounter lasted 6 minutes. That night, the Pacific Fleet received revised rules of engagement. The language was narrow, but the implication was not. Commanders were authorized to respond to hostile intent, not just hostile action. On April 21st, the first incident occurred at sea. A Chinese maritime militia vessel operating near the northern edge of the Spratly Islands closed rapidly on a U.S. destroyer conducting a freedom of navigation transit. The vessel ignored repeated warnings. When the range dropped below 1,000 meters, the destroyer altered course sharply to avoid collision. The militia vessel matched the maneuver. At 300 meters, the American ship fired warning shots into the water. The Chinese vessel veered away moments later. Footage of the encounter circulated within hours, framed differently on each side of the Pacific. Diplomatic protests followed. Neither altered posture. By late April, the tempo increased further. Chinese ballistic missile units conducted visible drills inland, their movements tracked openly by satellites and acknowledged in official statements. The exercises were framed as defensive. Their timing was not. On April 24th, at 58:48 UTC, a U.S. forces initiated a large-scale air and naval patrol operation across the Philippine Sea. Dozens of aircraft launched from carriers and regional bases. Tankers orbited at range. The patrol was not announced in advance. Chinese radar networks detected the activity within minutes. Fighters scrambled from multiple airfields along the coast. The first true standoff unfolded south of Taiwan. American and Chinese aircraft operated within overlapping patrol boxes for nearly 12 hours. Electronic warnings flashed in cockpits. Missiles remained on rails. Pilots reported intermittent radar locks that hardened, then faded. Several aircraft returned with sensor damage consistent with close proximity maneuvering. No shots were fired. Commanders on both sides described the day as successful. At sea, the situation deteriorated more quickly. On April 26th, a U.S. attack submarine detected multiple Chinese surface groups transiting north at speed. The formations included destroyers, frigates, and missile boats supported by logistics vessels. Their destination was unclear. American commanders repositioned surface assets accordingly. The Philippine Sea filled with ships maneuvering to deny space rather than seize it. The first casualties of the conflict occurred on April 27th. At 03:19 local time, a Chinese patrol aircraft conducting low-altitude surveillance over the South China Sea experienced mechanical failure and crashed into the water. The crew was lost. Chinese media reported the incident as an accident. U.S. officials issued a brief statement expressing regret. Internally, analysts noted the aircraft had been operating beyond its standard endurance profile. 2 days later, the conflict crossed an invisible line. On April 29th at 11:07 UTC, a Chinese anti-ship missile battery conducted a live fire test into an exclusion zone east of Hainan. The missile impacted as planned. The test was legal. It was also unmistakably timed. Within hours, U.S. naval forces adjusted formation spacing and activated additional defensive systems. That same evening, an American unmanned aircraft operating near the edge of the Taiwan Strait was illuminated by fire control radar. The illumination persisted for 14 seconds. It was enough. At 22:41 local time, the drone was destroyed by a Chinese missile. No warning was issued. No apology followed. The wreckage fell into international waters. The United States responded before dawn. At 04:12 UTC on April 30th, U.S. forces conducted a limited precision strike against a Chinese coastal radar installation believed to be involved in the engagement. The strike was executed by standoff munitions launched from international airspace. The installation was damaged but not destroyed. Civilian infrastructure was untouched. The message was narrow and unmistakable. China placed its Eastern Theater forces on heightened readiness within the hour. By the end of April, global shipping insurers had reclassified large portions of the Western Pacific as high-risk zones. Commercial traffic rerouted. Fuel prices began to rise. Governments urged calm. Military units continued to move. The war had not been declared, but it was no longer hypothetical.
By early May, restraint had become procedural rather than deliberate. Units operated on assumptions instead of confirmation. Every movement was interpreted through the expectation of contact, not the hope of avoidance. On May 2nd at 06:18 UTC, Chinese long-range rocket forces conducted a highly publicized readiness drill deep inland. Launch vehicles were rolled into open dispersal areas in full view of reconnaissance assets. No missiles were fueled. The display was symbolic, but its audience was narrow. Within hours, U.S. commanders elevated force protection levels across Guam and Okinawa. Aircraft were dispersed. Hardened shelters were activated for the first time since their construction. That same day, the United States formally placed Japanese and Australian naval units under a unified operational coordination framework. The decision was not announced publicly. It did not need to be. Chinese Naval Command detected the change almost immediately through altered patrol patterns and communications discipline. The battle space was no longer bilateral. The next flashpoint emerged near the Bashi Channel. On May 3rd, a mixed U.S.-Japanese surface group conducted a transit south of Taiwan under continuous air cover. Chinese naval aviation responded with sustained parallel patrols. Unlike earlier encounters, the aircraft maintained closer proximity. Radar locks hardened for longer intervals. One Japanese patrol aircraft reported missile seeker indications before countermeasures broke the lock. The incident was logged, classified, and absorbed into the growing catalog of near engagements. At sea, pressure mounted steadily. Chinese surface action groups began operating farther east than before, pushing into areas previously dominated by U.S. presence. The movements were slow, deliberate, and supported by shore-based missile coverage. American commanders responded by repositioning submarines and increasing airborne maritime surveillance. The Philippine Sea narrowed perceptibly. The first major exchange occurred on May 5th. At 1944 local time, a U.S. destroyer operating as part of a screening formation detected multiple fast-approaching surface contacts. Initial classification identified them as civilian fishing vessels. As the range closed, sensor signatures shifted. Heat profiles spiked. Encrypted transmissions appeared. The destroyer issued warnings. No response followed. When the distance dropped below 5 nautical miles, the ship opened fire with its deck gun. 2 vessels were disabled. A third detonated moments later, likely due to onboard munitions. Debris scattered across the water. No survivors were recovered. China denied military involvement. The denial carried little weight. Within hours, Chinese coastal missile units conducted snap drills along the southern coast. Missile boats surged from port. U.S. and Allied aircraft increased sortie rates in response. The cycle tightened. On May 6th, the air war began to take shape. Over the Philippine Sea, large formations of American and Allied aircraft conducted coordinated patrols designed to test response times. Chinese fighters scrambled repeatedly, often arriving within minutes. The encounters were no longer brief. Aircraft flew mirrored courses for hours, separated by kilometers rather than tens of kilometers. Pilots reported sustained electronic interference and aggressive maneuvering that pushed safety margins. That night, a Chinese fighter suffered a flameout during a high-stress intercept and ditched at sea. The pilot ejected and was recovered by a nearby vessel. Chinese media attributed the loss to mechanical failure. U.S. forces adjusted patrol altitudes the following day. By May 7th, Taiwan had fully transitioned to wartime readiness. Air raid drills were conducted nationwide. Reserve units reported to depots. Naval assets dispersed from port. Civilian ferries were requisitioned for logistics planning. The island had not been attacked, but its role in the conflict was no longer abstract. On May 8th, Chinese forces announced an expanded maritime security zone extending deep into the Philippine Sea. Commercial vessels were advised to reroute. Compliance was inconsistent. Several neutral ships continued transit under international law. One of them did not arrive. Late on May 9th, a container ship transiting east of Luzon lost contact. No distress signal was received. Satellite tracking ceased abruptly. Debris would later be found, but no official cause was assigned. The absence of explanation became its own signal. The largest engagement to date unfolded on May 10th. A U.S.-led surface group encountered a Chinese naval formation south of Okinawa. Both sides maneuvered aggressively within overlapping engagement envelopes. Aircraft surged overhead. Missile systems tracked targets continuously. For over 12 hours, the two formations circled each other, probing defenses, testing reaction times, searching for advantage without crossing the final line. At 21:53 local time, a Chinese vessel launched a missile on a high, non-terminal trajectory. The missile detonated at altitude, saturating sensors. It was a warning shot in every sense. The response was immediate. 2 U.S. interceptor missiles were launched, destroying the missile envelope before debris could impact Allied vessels. The detonations lit the sky briefly. Still no ship was struck. Still no casualties were recorded, but the exchange marked the end of plausible deniability. In Washington and Beijing, language shifted. Operational planners began using terms previously avoided: loss tolerance, exchange ratios, sustainment timelines. The assumption that escalation could be controlled remained, but it was no longer confident. On May 11th, the conflict claimed its first confirmed combat deaths. An Australian frigate operating under coalition command was struck by a loitering munition during nighttime operations north of Palawan. The weapon evaded close-in defenses and detonated near the superstructure. Damage control contained the fire, but 5 sailors were killed. Australia acknowledged the losses publicly within hours. China issued a statement denying responsibility. By mid-May, there was no longer any doubt. What had begun as signaling had become combat, limited, calibrated, but real. The war had entered its next phase.
By mid-May, the war shed its final constraints. Engagements were no longer framed as incidents or miscalculations. They were planned, sequenced, and anticipated. The remaining uncertainty lay not in whether force would be used, but where and how hard. On May 13th, at 02:47 UTC, Chinese long-range strike aircraft lifted from multiple airfields along the eastern coast, flying parallel courses toward the Philippine Sea. The formations remained outside engagement range, but their profiles were unmistakable. American airborne early warning assets tracked the movement continuously. Carrier air wings were brought to launch readiness, tankers repositioned. The airspace thickened. The first large-scale air engagement occurred hours later. South of Taiwan, mixed formations of U.S., Japanese, and Australian aircraft encountered incoming Chinese fighters operating under heavy ground-based support. Radar locks hardened almost immediately. Electronic countermeasures saturated the spectrum. Pilots reported conflicting target data as identification windows collapsed under jamming and proximity. At 11:26 local time, a Japanese fighter launched a missile after receiving confirmed hostile intent indicators. The missile struck a Chinese aircraft at altitude. The pilot did not eject. Within seconds, multiple missiles were airborne from both sides. Defensive systems reacted automatically. Countermeasures deployed. Several missiles detonated harmlessly. 2 found targets. By the time the engagement broke, 4 aircraft had been destroyed. Rescue efforts were limited by proximity to contested waters. Survivors were few. The exchange marked the first sustained air-to-air combat of the war. China responded asymmetrically. On May 14th, coordinated missile strikes targeted coalition airbases across Okinawa and northern Luzon. The attacks were precise and limited, designed to disrupt rather than annihilate. Several runways were cratered. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Casualty figures were withheld initially. Interceptors neutralized many incoming missiles. Some penetrated. Civilian areas were struck for the first time. In Naha, debris from an intercepted missile impacted residential districts, killing dozens. Images circulated globally before authorities could respond. Public pressure surged. Japan elevated its defense posture to full wartime status. Parliamentary approval followed within hours. The conflict had crossed from distant war to national emergency. At sea, escalation accelerated. On May 15th, coalition submarines engaged Chinese surface groups transiting east of Taiwan. Torpedoes were fired for the first time in the conflict. One Chinese destroyer was struck and disabled, later sinking during attempted recovery. Survivors were rescued by accompanying vessels. The loss was acknowledged publicly by Beijing the following day. Retaliation came swiftly. Chinese anti-ship missile salvos targeted coalition naval formations operating in the Philippine Sea. Defensive systems were saturated by volume. Several missiles were intercepted, others were not. A U.S. cruiser was hit amidships, suffering catastrophic damage. Fires burned uncontrolled for hours. Evacuation efforts continued through the night. Hundreds were killed. By May 16th, the largest naval battle of the conflict was underway. Over 50 surface combatants, supported by submarines and carrier aviation, converged in overlapping engagement zones east of Taiwan. Missile launches occurred in waves. Air defenses strained under sustained pressure. The sea became a maze of smoke, burning fuel and debris. Commanders struggled to maintain situational awareness as sensors degraded and communications fractured. By nightfall, multiple warships from both sides had been sunk or crippled. Casualty estimates reached into the thousands. No side achieved decisive advantage. The engagement achieved only one outcome: confirmation that the war could not be contained. On May 21st, China expanded its target set. Ballistic missile strikes hit military infrastructure across Guam for the first time. Interceptors neutralized many threats, but several impacts caused significant damage to logistics hubs and fuel storage. U.S. forces dispersed assets further, stretching already strained supply lines. That same day, Taiwan was struck directly. Missile and air attacks targeted airfields, naval bases, and command facilities across the island. Air defenses intercepted a portion of the strikes. Others penetrated. Runways burned. Aircraft were destroyed. Civilian casualties mounted despite attempts to avoid population centers. Taiwan's government declared the island under active invasion threat. On May 18th, Chinese amphibious forces began visible preparations along the coast. Landing ships loaded under heavy air cover. Armored vehicles staged near embarkation points. The movements were broadcast openly. There was no attempt to concealment.
The message was unmistakable. Coalition forces responded immediately. Submarines moved into firing positions. Mine-laying operations began in the Taiwan Strait. Carrier air wings surged. The narrow body of water became the most heavily monitored and contested maritime zone on Earth. The most dangerous moment came on May 19th. Early warning systems detected multiple missile launches from inland China. Trajectory analysis suggested strikes consistent with theater-level escalation. Command centers elevated readiness levels. Strategic assets prepared for worst-case scenarios. Minutes later, analysis confirmed conventional payloads. The missiles struck military targets across Taiwan and the surrounding region. The world exhaled briefly. By the end of May's third week, the Third World War had revealed its true character. It was no longer about signaling or deterrence. It was about control of sea lanes, airspace, and the fate of an island that neither side could afford to lose. And everyone understood what came next. Once land was contested, there would be no ambiguity left.
By late May, the line between preparation and execution had ceased to exist. What intelligence services once labeled as indicators became actions. Units no longer waited for authorization to reposition. They moved under standing orders written for a conflict everyone had hoped would never fully arrive. On May 22nd at 01:14 local time, Chinese amphibious forces began embarking from multiple ports along the Fujian coast. Satellite imagery confirmed the movement in real time. There was no attempt at concealment. Landing ships, escorted by surface combatants and covered by dense air patrols, assembled in staging areas just beyond port approaches. The scale exceeded previous exercises by a significant margin. Taiwan declared a state of national emergency within minutes. Air raid sirens echoed across Taipei before dawn. Civil defense protocols were activated nationwide. Reserve formations mobilized en masse. Highway systems were converted into dispersal routes. Civilian traffic disappeared from the streets as the island prepared not for pressure, but for assault. The United States and its allies did not wait for confirmation of intent. At 03:42 UTC, coalition forces initiated a coordinated interdiction campaign across the Taiwan Strait. The objective was limited and explicit: deny transit, disrupt landing forces, and avoid deep strikes into the Chinese mainland. It was the narrowest path between deterrence and catastrophe. Submarines engaged first. As Chinese amphibious groups moved into the strait, coalition submarines launched torpedoes against high-value transports. Multiple vessels were struck before escorts could react. Fires spread rapidly among tightly packed ships. Damaged landing craft drifted out of formation. Rescue efforts were abandoned as air defenses shifted to counter incoming strikes. Chinese forces responded with overwhelming fire. Shore-based missile batteries launched salvos toward suspected submarine positions and coalition surface groups. The strait filled with explosions and countermeasures. Several missiles struck decoys, others found targets. A Japanese destroyer was hit and disabled, remaining afloat, but combat ineffective. Casualty figures were withheld. Above the chaos, the air war intensified. Hundreds of aircraft from both sides surged into the narrow airspace over the strait. Dogfights erupted amid missile trails and flares. Pilots operated at the edge of fuel endurance. Losses mounted rapidly. Recovery operations were limited by ongoing combat. Many aircraft never returned. By mid-morning, the amphibious assault began to collapse. Precision strikes shredded landing formations before they reached effective range. Transports burned. Vehicles sank with their cargo still aboard. The sea became littered with debris and fuel slicks stretching for kilometers. What remained of the assault turned back under heavy escort. But collapse did not mean resolution. At 11:58 UTC, Chinese long-range rocket forces expanded their target set. Missile strikes hit military infrastructure across Taiwan, Okinawa, and Guam simultaneously.
Some were intercepted, others were not. Runways were cratered, fuel depots ignited, aircraft were destroyed on the ground, civilian casualties were confirmed in multiple locations. In Japan, a missile strike near Naha killed dozens of civilians. Images spread globally within minutes. The reaction was immediate. Japan formally declared itself under armed attack. Full wartime mobilization followed. The war widened beyond the Strait. On May 24th, coalition forces conducted their deepest strikes of the conflict, targeting Chinese naval bases and logistics hubs supporting operations against Taiwan. The strikes were precise, limited, and devastating. Multiple facilities were rendered inoperable. China responded with further missile attacks against regional bases. The largest naval engagement of the war unfolded that night east of Taiwan. Dozens of surface combatants converged under constant air attack. Missile salvos saturated defenses. Ships burned. Damage control teams fought fires as systems failed around them. By dawn, several major warships from both sides lay sunk. Thousands were dead. No side claimed victory. By May 26th, global consequences became unavoidable. Commercial shipping withdrew from the Western Pacific almost entirely. Energy prices surged worldwide. Governments released strategic reserves. Rationing discussions began quietly. The war was no longer confined to the region. It had reached the global economy. Behind closed doors, diplomatic channels reopened with urgency not seen before. Messages moved through neutral intermediaries. Proposals were exchanged, rejected, revised. None addressed the core issue. Neither side could retreat without unacceptable loss. The most dangerous moment came on May 28th. Early warning systems detected a confirmed missile launch from deep within Chinese territory. Trajectory analysis suggested a profile consistent with strategic delivery. Coalition strategic forces elevated readiness immediately. Launch protocols were initiated. For 4 minutes, the world stood on the edge of irreversible escalation. The missile self-destructed in the upper atmosphere. China later described the incident as a technical failure during a conventional test. The explanation convinced no one. What mattered was proximity. Humanity had come within minutes of annihilation without intent or decision. That night, doctrines shifted quietly. Nuclear thresholds were reevaluated. Red lines were clarified, then blurred. Deterrence no longer rested on certainty, but on fear of miscalculation. By the end of May, the war entered a grim stability. Fighting continued daily, but within unspoken limits. Front lines solidified at sea and in the air. Taiwan remained contested but unoccupied. No decisive victory emerged, only exhaustion. Tens of thousands were dead. Entire fleets were damaged or destroyed. Trust between nations had evaporated. The Third World War had not ended the world. It had revealed how close it was to doing so. And in the quiet intervals between missile launches and emergency meetings, a shared understanding settled across command centers on both sides of the Pacific. There would be no victory here, only survival, and the knowledge that once the borders were broken, they could never truly be restored.